Greetings, my name is Slight, and this is part 1 of my epic Crown Prince guide. I've played over 50 runs of the Crown Prince on Solo Nightmare because I found him to be difficult and much more interesting than the dog, so I decided to take the challenge on. I've increased my success rate from about 15% when I started to 80% over the last 10 Solo Nightmare runs, and I'm here to share what I learned through that experience. When I started playing the cat, I was already winning pretty consistently with the bird when I was playing him on Solo Nightmare, so it was a huge transition. Part 1 addresses what I have deemed as like the elite level tips, tricks, and strategies that are intended to help people conquer solo elite mode and be a better player. More importantly though, there are a foundation that is built on for the next video which is intended for Solo Nightmare tips. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Always aim smoke grenades at the ground, near enemies, and not directly at enemies. And this has two implications. So if you happen to hit an enemy or a barrel or some kind of interactable with a grenade, it will bounce instead of exploding, and then slowly arc through the air an extra time before then hitting the ground and exploding. So the first implication is that you want to hit the ground. The second implication is that you want to hit it near enemies with the intention to hit as many enemies as possible. So splitting the difference between two enemies and hitting right in between them is always much better. In a similar vein, if you're about to be surrounded by enemies, aim directly below you and throw a grenade at your feet, then dash away toward the safest direction immediately. This is the cat's best inherent escape tool, and thematically it makes sense. Smoke grenades are classically thrown at your feet so you can disappear. Shoot your energy orb in such a way as you're trying to hit multiple people with it. The hitbox for the projectile of the energy orb is always smaller than the hitbox for the detonation of the energy orb. This can take some practice, but aiming at walls and floors and a centralized enemy within a group of enemies will allow you to maximize the effectiveness of each use of energy orb each time you cast it. And it's important for some other benefits of using this ability. This is probably one of the most important skills to master with the cat, because playing the exact range of what you can hit with the energy orb is very, very useful. Do not hesitate to use smoke grenades, even on a single non-enhanced enemy. Let me tell you, enemies who are not decayed are 2 to 5 times harder to kill, especially in the late game. Think of it like this. Without decay, an enemy is twice as fast, you cannot apply miasma or explosion to them, and you lose all of your bonuses from enemies being under an elemental effect, which all coalesce to reduce your damage dramatically. Most players worry that they're going to run out of grenades when doing this, but the game is very forgiving with the way that it replenishes ammo and secondary abilities. I've not been able to directly confirm this, but my experience has been that the fewer grenades or ammo that you have stored, you will have a higher chance for a destructible object to give you what you're missing. So, if you keep your grenades low by using more of them, more grenades will drop from destructibles, and you will overall be able to throw significantly more grenades. Also importantly is that peddlers sell ammo and grenades for cheap, dirt cheap. And once you get the refill talent from your talent tree, you can refill your grenades twice, which means at a base capacity of 8 grenades, you can throw 24 grenades in one room with a peddler before you would run out. So, always apply decay with your smoke grenades. Most of your damage comes from explosion fusions or miasma fusions. You should be playing with this basically at the forefront of your mind. This means that you should basically never play with weapons that have specifically the corrosion effect past the first few stages, as their damage type is redundant and weak for the Crown Prince. Instead of doing that, pick up weapons with the fire and lightning effects, and they will trigger those fusion effects and be much more powerful on average, even without good inscriptions. Weapons with a high percent elemental effect chance are often the most consistent weapons for the cat. To name one such weapon from a few different weapon categories would be the Flame Dragon, the Pupil, and the Piercing Flame. As a general rule of thumb, when picking between scrolls for the Crown Prince, slow or corrosion immunity is king. I rate it so highly because the cat, and this is true for the dog as well, have no effective form of escape at the mid to long range. And what I mean by that is that when other enemies are good at the mid to long range, you have a hard time escaping that threat range effectively. So, any slow that's placed on you when you're in a mid and high range threat is very likely to result in a death in Elite Solo and especially in Solo Nightmare. So, slow and corrosion immunity should be extremely high tier, and every time you see them, you should notice. Hex Smoke. Oh, Hex Smoke level 1 is probably the best single point ascension in the game. Being able to reduce a sizable group of enemies' damage by 50% without a complex setup, or slow aiming process, or a short amount of time is extremely good and cannot be found on any other character. It is so good that the 20% damage increase on enemies is just, that's just gravy on you're just pouring gravy on top of that. This ascension would still be ridiculously strong even if it did not add any damage, and that's an indication of how good it is. The common weapon inscription that reads plus 50% damage to enemies under the decay effect is exceptionally strong for you. In fact, all three of these types of inscriptions tend to be best for the cat, because it's very often the case that you will have 2 elemental effects applied to any single target. For comparison, look at these inscriptions and notice how each of these damage increases comes at a significant cost. Taking 50% damage for something that's pretty much guaranteed to be happening all the time while you're playing the cat is extremely powerful and should not be underrated. In OG Mako's Crown Prince tips and tricks video, he mentions that you should be very cautious about taking curse scrolls as the cat. The elemental curse disables your ability to inflict elemental effects, which means that your grenades no longer apply decay, which is game losing. As there are 10 curse scrolls at the time of recording this, each time that you take a curse scroll represents at least a 10% chance of directly losing the run. Be very, very cautious about taking a curse scroll, as it can have that much of a detrimental effect, especially in solo. Let's get a little nitty-gritty with how the base elemental effects actually work. Having a basis for this is quite useful and will help explain some things that you're seeing as you're playing more. So number 1 is Burning Effect. This effect does 20% of the damage that you dealt in one hit each second over 5 seconds for a total of 100 extra damage. Alright? This damage cannot overlap with itself. So what that means is that the highest damage burning effect that would be applied to anyone is the only one that's active. To go into a little bit more detail, as an example, imagine that you hit a unit for 100 fire damage. Okay, so that unit would take 20 damage each second for 5 seconds for another 100 damage. But say after the first second you hit him with 1,000 damage fire damage and he gets the burning effect. It negates the other burning damage and only deals the highest burning damage each second. Technically, all other burning effects that are being applied that are weaker than this very high damage one are actually being applied. So if this one runs out and there's a weaker one that's still technically going on, then the damage just lowers and the burning continues. But it will always do the highest damage one and only one each second. Shock deals 50% of its damage in an AoE and causes the unit that is shocked to take 10% more damage from all sources. This means that enemies clumped together will take significant damage from shock actually. This also means that from a DPS perspective, the shock effect is probably the best elemental effect on its own, just from a damage per second standpoint. Lastly, we've got our boy Decay. Decay slows movement speed by 50%, which is a lot. A 50% slow is a very, very powerful slow effect. Importantly, this does not have any effect on attack speed, nor does it affect enemies' dodge speed. Well, that wraps up the last of the elite level tips. Feel free to stick around. When I originally recorded this video, I went on a bit of a ramble about how I distinguish between elite tips and nightmare tips, so please stick around if you want to hear about that, but please do not if that does not sound interesting. I really appreciate everyone who helped me get some of this information. The moderators in the Discord chat were extremely useful. Those guys who update the Gunfire wiki, exceptionally useful. And another tips and tricks video I watched was OG Mako's tips and tricks, and he has a lot of good Gunfire content as well. So thanks to all those guys, and I hope you guys have a great day. Stick around if you want to hear me talk about something that's not super important. Have a good one. My opinion about the separation of echelons of players comes from my experience in being like a mid-skill competitive Dota 2 player. There's never anyone that was exceptional, but I did play a lot and I was very good. I was in the top 0.5% of Dota 2 players, which is still not amazing, but it is good. And what I recognized was that the difference between the average player and a mid-skill, just a ladder player, was maybe 10 kind of big things, that could be talked about, that could be improved upon. But the difference between a mid-skill player and a high-skill player, well, maybe they had one kind of thing, maybe two things that was really like kind of big things that pulled them back. But it was also like 100 little things. Like, if I watched their replay, I could probably say 100 things. I could probably say more about the replay than the replay went on. I could talk longer than the actual game was because of how many small things add up to a big change. And this trend that you're noticing extends in higher and higher skill. So the difference between a high skill player and a very high skill player might be, 500 little things. Little tiny tweaks in the way that they play and do things, but they add up, 25 little things that is specific to a matchup against another person matters a lot. So these elite level tips are a little bit more broad and they're a little bit more down to earth. The nightmare tips are trying to get a little bit more detailed, which means that they necessitate a little bit more talking. So once I have that where I want it, there'll be a fully fledged solo nightmare tips that's coming out, and it should be relatively soon. And hopefully that is helpful. It will be a little bit heady. And so hopefully that's, and I'm hoping that will be a good thing instead of a bad thing. Anyway, please let me know if you learned anything, and if this was helpful. I've got another fully fledged solo nightmare tip list coming up, which will be the solo nightmare ones. Share your own tips if you have them, because that's good for everyone. That makes everyone better. And one thing that's interesting is something that I learned from the Dota community as well. As the whole community got better, it enforced is the wrong word, but maybe allowed or caused there to be changes in the game. Because once the community figured it out and became common knowledge, then it had to be updated and it had to change. And so the more we are all on board about what's good and what's working, the more interesting the game is going to be, because that means that the game can change faster and that we will figure it out even quicker. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on here at the end, and I hope you meet all of the expectations that you've set for yourself.